Hi guys, welcome to the channel. In this video I'm going to be building this realistic jungle diorama. You might have seen my recent video on my wrecked Japanese Zero, and this diorama is going to provide a home for that kit. And the vibe I'm going for here is several decades post-war. You can see from the aircraft model that I did very heavy weathering, which is clearly more than would happen in just a couple of years, so I'm really going for this heavily overgrown, very old wreck kind of vibe. One of the images I used as a reference for this diorama is this one here. This is a fantastic image. I found this very evocative with the idea of the jungle starting to reclaim the aircraft like it's been there for a long time. I took some XPS foam and cut it to approximately the right size, and after trying a few configurations I settled on this one here with the aircraft slightly raised, a rock wall in front of it over which a small stream would flow to form a waterfall. So I cut the XPS into a very approximate shape. While the PVA glue was drying, I made a number of boulders from offcuts of XPS foam, and I spent a lot of time sanding those down to round off the edges and make sure everything was nice and smooth and much more boulder-like. I use this modelling paste here to attach the boulders and some other small stones to make the very first ground layer. Once that was done, the depth of the stream in the centre wasn't quite high enough, so I built up the banks using some sculptor mould. While I was doing this, I kept checking to ensure the aircraft would still fit well. You can see I've also added a couple of sticks there to act as logs in the stream. I used diluted PVA glue to add sand to the stream bed. I took some of the smaller sticks and glued them to the base to look like debris which had washed down the stream and become trapped in the rocks. And once everything had dried in about 24 hours, I gave the entire base a coat of paint using Tamiya rattle cans. This was an olive drab colour which I happened to have left over, but these paints are really good because they'll stick to anything, they are very durable, and this base colour means that if I miss any areas later when I'm painting, there won't be a strange unnatural patch of white revealed. The propellant in the rattle cans can damage the XPS foam, so you just have to make sure that you do it somewhere where there's a bit of a breeze and keep the can distant from the foam. Because it is quite difficult to get those rattle cans to spray into all the nooks and crannies, after I'd done that I used the airbrush to apply some black and fill all those remaining gaps. And that also acts a bit like a shadow coat, just like you would do on a normal armour model. The next step was to block in the main colours, as you can see here. So I've got some wooden deck tan and some buff which I used for the riverbed, a series of greys for the rocks, and then some brown for the wooden fallen trees. And in terms of the rocks, basically I put a few drops of grey in the airbrush with some thinner, sprayed a few rocks, dropped in maybe a drop of black or a drop of brown or a drop of tan just to change the shade slightly, and carried on spraying. And the effect of that is that each of those rocks should be a subtly different shade. I picked out the small details such as the fallen tree branches using a brush. The rocks were given a dry brush of a lighter grey to highlight the edges. And then I used a series of oil paint washes over the rocks. These are Abteilung 502 oil paints. In some cases I use the oil paints only to highlight cracks or ridges in the rocks. And in other cases I did the entire rock in the oil paint to act as a filter and to change the tone slightly. Of course, some of these rocks are going to be in the path of the water, so I used some green oil paint to suggest slime and moss and so on, which has accumulated on those particular rocks. Of course, this is supposed to be the jungle, and so it's not just the rocks in the water which might have that kind of moss growing on them. To make the trees, I took some sticks and attached them together to form tree structures. To make the joints sturdy, I drilled some small holes and used some brass rod superglued inside. To give the impression of vascular systems in the tree and vines and creepers and so on, I used the inside of an electrical cable. I I got this idea from the YouTube channel Paper Cuts, and I would thoroughly recommend you check out his channel because he does some fantastic terrain. I used this DAS air drying clay to build the buttress supports for some of the trees. At this stage I wasn't too bothered about the texture or even fingerprints because I would cover this clay later on. Once I was happy with the twigs and with the cables to form the vines, I gave the entire tree a coat of undiluted PVA glue. I added toilet paper over the top and pushed that into shape with some diluted PVA glue. It doesn't matter if the toilet paper has patterns or writing in it, because that can easily be smoothed out with the glue. At first it can look like a mess, but after a couple of layers of toilet paper, the texture really starts to take effect. The important thing is to get rid of any obvious edges of the sheets or any sharp corners which clearly look like they're not part of the tree. For the fine branches at the very end, I drilled some 0.5mm holes and attached some dried sea foam. Vines and creepers and things like this are a key part of jungle terrain. So to simulate those, I took some string and pulled out the individual threads. I thought they would make good vines. So I mixed up a container of dark green paint and dipped some pieces of string in it. And then I remembered I had this old moss which I'd bought specifically for a jungle diorama. So I took some of that, cut it to length, and did the same thing. And here you can see one of the trees with some of those string vines added. Sometimes you see vines like this which have wrapped around a tree that has subsequently died. To make this, I set the string around a pencil while the paint was still drying. The trees were given a base colour of various brown or grey colours. I tried to make each tree a different colour. And then I dry brushed on top of those, in this case a medium brown colour. And in this case a grey colour, the aim being of course to bring out the texture of the tree. I also used an oil paint wash in parts of the trees, the aim being to further break down the uniformity of the colour. You have to go quite heavy with these washes on the trees made from paper, because of course the paper does absorb a lot of them. To make the foliage for all the trees, I dipped the ends of them, which are made from seafoam, into this scenic cement. And then I sprinkled over the top some of this countryside scenics scatter. The trees were then attached to the main base by drilling a couple of holes and using some plaster to secure them. I could have used sculptor mould, but plaster dries quicker and I was in a hurry to get moving. And at this stage the diorama was starting to take shape. Some of these string vines were a little bit springy, so I glued them to the ground. And added a few more of those moss creepers, vines, roots, whatever you want to call them, to the ground as well. There's still the mud layer to go on, so the majority of this will be covered, and of course any glue marks will definitely be covered. Later on in the project I made my own leaves, but I did use some of these small green leaves that I had from a previous project. Of course there's stuff growing everywhere in the jungle, and mushrooms and fungi are one of those things. So looking at a couple of reference photos, I decided to make some from some epoxy putty. This is 2-part epoxy putty. You take the hardener and the putty, mix them till the colour is uniform, and then you've got maybe 10 minutes to shape things. I attach those to the trees using super glue. The next step was to produce a lot of leaf litter ready for the groundwork. I used real leaves to do this. They're free and they're available in a variety of colours. I pressed through the leaves using several different leaf presses. And after a couple of hours of stamping, this gave me a decent collection of leaves. Of course, this aircraft's been sitting in the jungle for some time, so we need some leaves in the cockpit as well. PVA glue was used to attach them. The next step was to make the ground cover mud layer. The next step was to make the mud for the ground cover. My original plan was to use some of this thick mud from Vallejo, but unfortunately when I opened the container it seems to have set already. You can see it's quite rubbery here, and even with some water there's no way to turn this back the way it should be. So I gave up on that one. I considered using some of this modelling paste from Liquidex. I've used this before. But then I thought I will go to my good old AK Interactive ground paste. This is the wet ground one. When I was in the process of building the trees, I got lots of small pieces of bark breaking off and bits of sawdust and things like that. I kept those in a container. I took about half of the leaves that I cut, some more of that moss, emptied about half of the tub of that mud effect, and made a lovely concoction containing all of those items. With hindsight, I would say I perhaps didn't need to do that. As you can see when I'm applying that mud, the majority of that material has been lost. You can't really tell the leaves are in there, you can't tell the sawdust is in there. You can tell that the roots and the moss are in there, but I think I could have left the leaves out and just added them on top, which I always plan to do anyway. When adding those leaves, I wanted to avoid the impression that they were floating on top of the mud, so I pressed them in slightly using some tweezers. I also tried to smooth the edge between the mud and the sandy riverbank. You can do that with a small amount of water. And this is the big commitment step, because the aircraft has been here long enough that we would expect it to be embedded in the ground. And so that means I've got to put the model now in the right position in the mud before the acrylic paste dries. And then it's not coming back out. And again, of course, the thing about the jungle is that it's kind of chaotic. There are things are growing everywhere, every direction, at every level. So I tried to put some more of those roots and creepers and vines and so on in here. While the mud is wet, that makes a good anchor for these things. And of course it helps to give the impression that the zero is becoming part of the terrain again, that it's been overgrown by the landscape. I used a layer of scenic cement to make sure that all the leaves were properly stuck down to the base. The next step was the most nerve-wracking one, which is the water. I used masking tape to block off the lower edge of the diorama base. My original plan was to use this easy cast epoxy resin, and it is supposed to be quite good, but I still remember my failure last time when I used resin on my Schwimmwagen diorama, when it basically bubbled and went crazy. Now this resin is supposed to be better, but I still chickened out of using it, and I decided to use some of this good old Krycell water. Like resin, this has two parts, but it isn't an epoxy resin. I'm not quite sure what it is. It forms a kind of rubbery substance when it dries. It can be poured to any depth, and also it doesn't generate any heat or any bubbles as it cures, which is perfect for this application. If you remember back in my French R35 mini diorama, I used this to make some of the water in the ditch. I've got two types of the A bottle. One is clear and one has this brown material suspended in it. I needed both of these for the diorama, so I put the brown first of all in a container, then the clear, and mix them. These are both part A, so they're not going to start curing at this point. Then I added the part Bs, mix them thoroughly. And this kind of container is probably not the best for containing your resin water because it's hard to pour from it. I used a barbecue skewer to guide the water slightly and poured it gently into the space. With the trees and everything being in place, some of the parts of the diorama were quite hard to reach, so I used a pipette to get the water into those positions. You can see here, as the water is starting to dry, there are no bubbles forming on the surface. The liquid has been absorbed slightly by that tree there, but you would expect that with any kind of water product, and of course it looks quite natural. As it happened, I had lots of spare material left over. This is the spare material 12 hours later, and you can see this has formed a kind of rubbery substance, and it's even possible to just peel it away from the edge of the container here. And that bit broke off. You can see it's a kind of rubbery, transparent material. So yes, I definitely recommend this, guys. This is called Krycell water, and it's from Precision Ice and Snow. Definitely something I'll be buying again. To add water effects, so some ripples and the small waterfalls, I used this Liquitex heavy gloss gel. I applied it with a paintbrush into the areas where the water will be cascading over the rocks. This will dry clear. Sometimes you need to add it in multiple layers to get the effect you want. The final step of the diorama involved creating some plants. To do that, I use these paper plants from a variety of companies. This particular brand come on white paper, and you simply paint them with an airbrush and then cut them out. You can see there's a variety of shapes and styles. I also had these ones from Ammo by Mig. These come pre-printed on green paper. They're a little bit thinner than the other ones. This is the result of airbrushing all of those. I put some green paint in the airbrush, and then after every couple of leaves I added 1 or 2 drops of a slightly different shade of green, and that just gives some subtle variation. You can see that the plants from Mig even have a little snake down here, and a few geckos and frogs and similar jungle critters. They also quite nicely have these holes in these plants here, which are designed to simulate insects and things eating those leaves, which I thought was quite a nice touch. And of course, references are critical, so after some extensive research I decided to paint this guy yellow and black so that he can be a 1/35th scale banded crate. See if you can spot him in the final diorama. This is my collection of painted and cut out leaves, and then the supplied wire was painted and used to make stalks and stems. And I think these plants look pretty good actually. I was pleasantly surprised for how they turned out. To add the plants to the terrain, I drilled a small hole. I fitted the first couple of leaves in and got them in position without using any glue. Once I was happy, I added some glue to the last leaf, put that in position, and of course that glue is going to glue all of the leaves in place. I wanted to go for a mix of medium and ground level plants, because things really do grow everywhere in the jungle. Even a couple of tiny leaves on the aircraft. And with that done, that was finally the end of the build, so let's see the final result. Well guys, there we go, that was my wrecked Japanese Zero jungle diorama. This was easily the most involved diorama I've made to date and one that I spent the most hours on. I had fantastic fun making everything here from the XPS foam for the rocks all the way up to the weathering and the plants and the trees and so on. I learnt a lot making this and it was very enjoyable as well, and I'm really pleased with the final result. This video, like my other videos, would not have been possible without the help of my Patreon supporters. Their generous support helps to keep this channel growing, and it helps with things like the oil paints and the paper plants which we use in this diorama. If you'd like to join the Patreon scheme, you can find out more information in the link below. And whether you are a Patreon member or not, thank you very much for watching, guys, and if you can think of any ideas for a future diorama, then please do add them in the comments below. I'm always interested to hear your ideas and suggestions. And until next time, I will leave you with some other videos you might like to watch.